Well, good morning, everyone, and I hope you will be able to join us in your seats soon, those of you in the back of the room. Thank you. I'm David Skaggs. My excuse for vulnerability this morning, picking up on the theme of Pedro's wonderful sermon, is that I'm a member of the choir, and we'll leave it at that for now. But a privilege to be asked to be the moderator of a panel to deal with the question of reflections on discrimination. I think Pedro and his remarks and service have powerfully prepared us for this conversation, and we thank him for that. And the invocation of the death of Martin Luther King Jr., the 50th anniversary of that sad day this past week, also serves as a reminder that our national history is a catalog of that bending of the arc of history that King reminded us of from time to time, ever closer to but never quite achieving the justice and freedom for all that we hold dear. So this morning, and really into this afternoon, we have four kind ladies who are here to help enlighten us with their reflections on discrimination. As a people, we have professed to, again, using the words of our service, widen the circle and disavow discrimination in this society, but that profession has not been fully realized. So I think we are all mindful of the need to be reminded and reflective on the various ways in which we still have much progress to make. So to help us with that ongoing challenge and task, we have four panelists. I will introduce them all briefly now, and they will then offer some remarks, 5 minutes or so each. We'll have a little bit of dialogue amongst the panelists, I hope, and then have some time for Q&A before we adjourn. So to speak first is Hannah Pritchard, a 17-year-old, is that right, junior at Boulder High School, Fairview High School, oh my God. Lord, forgive me. She's very active in her school community, engaged in science, it appears, from the Physics Club and an MIT program, National Honor Society, lots of outdoor activity, and wants to go on to law school and study human rights law and eventually become involved in politics. We can talk about that later. Sandra Saltrese, a very experienced local Boulder immigration attorney, has fought for years and years and has her arms and heart and hands full these days in dealing with clients facing the challenges of immigration court and federal court. She opened her own immigration law firm, was a supervising attorney in immigration law at one of Denver's well-established nonprofits. She specializes in appellate litigation, and we were commiserating about being before the 10th Circuit shortly, her more than I. Mardi Moore at the far end is from a Colorado pioneer family, going back how many generations?
I think I'm the fourth.
Fourth generation. After many years of work in social justice and LGBTQ rights in Seattle and New York, she came back here to Boulder a few years ago and is executive director of Out Boulder County. In the 5 years she's been there, that nonprofit has opened offices in Longmont, added a lot of programs and services, and increased the profile of that effort amongst all of us in Boulder County. And finally, Jean Dubofsky, who really needs no introduction, has been with us in this congregation for a long time. I've been privileged to know Jean for a long time. She really exemplifies public service and the calling of the legal profession to do everything that we can as lawyers to advance the cause of justice in this country.
Hello, my name is Hannah Pritchard and I'm a junior at Fairview High School. I'm here today to provide this panel with a young person's perspective on some of the most pressing social issues relevant to these changing times. As part of Boulder's youth, I can attest to the fact that as a generation of growing and learning young people, our views on each issue presented today are incredibly diverse. I can only do my part to shed some light on my own views and interpret as best I can the views of my peers, but I do not pretend to be able to speak on their behalf. Dr. Martin Luther King once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." As young people growing up in the current political and social climate, my peers and I see a world divided. The issues around race, gay rights, and gender equality are incredibly charged and are often a source of discord between family members, neighbors, and friends. We live in a world of such tribalism that it is easy to hate and disregard those who do not agree with us. But the moment we brush someone off as a lost cause, we lose the opportunity to add one more person to our ranks. We must be open to answering questions and compassionate towards those who may be ignorant to our message. Only if we face everyone with acceptance will we truly have the impact that we wish to see on the world. The first issue I address is the relations between the different races and ethnicities present in our country. The freedom to befriend, love, and learn with whomever we choose has become a point of pride in this country. We rightfully hold in esteem such leaders as Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks as pinnacles of the American spirit. We point to their victories as the complete legacy of racial equality in the United States. However, this idea of any complete legacy is a dangerous one. It encourages complacency. Great strides have been made thanks to the works of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and other civil rights advocates, but now new issues plague the fight for racial equality. Blatant discrimination is out of fashion in many areas now. Now the real danger lies in subtle disrespect, hidden fear, and cruelty that is shrouded in secrecy and shadow. As a student growing up in Boulder, a city not known for its racial or economic diversity, the main issues that many of my friends who are racial minorities face revolve around the ignorance of their classmates and their own feelings of isolation. At school, racism is often a topic of discussion between peers. However, many students possess certain misconceptions about racial issues which are not addressed in the classroom. There is a verbal acknowledgement of white privilege, but a lack of understanding as to the extent that race truly dictates the lives of every American. Due to a school environment that simply does not have the diversity it needs to be provided insight into racial issues, many of my peers who are minorities feel isolated and without people to talk to regarding their experiences as Black, Asian, or Latino teens in Boulder. The second issue I address is the treatment of LGBTQ community members. Acceptance has increased exponentially in the last 20 years alone, making school a much safer place for gay and trans students than it once was. On the adult teacher and administration level, large steps have been taken to improve the high school experience for LGBT teens. From middle school onwards, we host public speakers and attend assemblies advocating for LGBTQ rights. Every year before we begin classes, we fill out note cards with our pronouns on them so that teachers can be more accommodating of people's genders and identities. However, students who are part of the LGBT community are still made to feel unwelcome in certain circles of students, are wrongfully labeled as more promiscuous than their straight peers, and are belittled by the assumption that they are too young to know their sexuality. The word gay is still used as a derogatory insult, and the LGBT community is often the brunt of insensitive jokes which may seem harmless at the time, but contribute to an environment of intolerance. The fight for LGBT rights in high school must also be a fight against bullying and ostracization. The third issue I address is gender equality in America, and especially what the fight for gender equality means for the younger generations. 100 years ago, equality for women was based around women's suffrage. Then it was about the right to exist outside of the home, and recently it has been about issues such as equal pay and sexual harassment. For us, for girls who are just becoming women and in many ways are still naive about the institutionalized disrespect that we will face in adulthood, the inequalities we face look different. For us, gender discrimination means being shamed as sluts, while young men are praised for being players. It means being used for sexual favors and then tossed aside like used towels for the hopes of rising in social rank. It means being forced to choose between being fun and being smart. It means being tormented online for our bodies and learning from a young age how to fend off unwanted advances. For us, gender inequality isn't about the wage gap yet. For now, gender inequality is about the social strata that rule girls' lives, define who they are, and shape who they are expected to be. The great question of the ages for any issue, not just these, is how does one come to an agreement with a person whom you simply cannot understand? Well, from childhood onward, we are taught to answer that question with a remarkably simple word: compromise. But to be frank, I see no compromising on what seem to me to be basic human rights. Perhaps compassion is a better word. It is in my view that much of the intolerance plaguing America today is due to a lack of education. We must acknowledge people's fears and their ignorance. We must have compassion for people's feelings that the world is turning without them. We must stand our ground and allow opposition to strengthen our resolve and sharpen our arguments. Our loyalty to our country demands that we make it better. Our loyalty to our children demands for us to prepare a world of acceptance and love in which to welcome them. And our loyalty to each other calls for respect, unity, and standing up for what is right no matter the cost.
I just want to say one thing, Hannah. I just really hope you follow that trajectory of going into the legal profession. We need you. And politics. Immigration. There's too much to say, but I think a lot of the people here know quite a bit given the media coverage and the flashpoint of immigration. First of all, discrimination has always been a factor in the enactment and implementation of immigration laws. Always been there. From the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was repealed in 1943. Why was it repealed? Well, because China became an ally with the United States to fight against Japan and the Axis. And then we had quotas, racial quotas, specific racial quotas that did not end till 1951. And the whole trajectory of immigration law is always also tied to labor, skilled labor and unskilled labor. And 1951 was a banner year, or a real juncture in immigration law in this country, because it enacted, or didn't really enact, it signed on to the United Nations Convention Against Torture as a response to the Holocaust in Europe. And that's really critical in understanding a very large part of immigration law in this country right now. The Immigration and Refugee Act, which was enacted as a response to our signing on to that Convention Against Torture, basically says that this country cannot turn anyone back if they fear persecution on account of being a member of a religious group, a social group, or for their political opinion or their race. And right now, as we sit here, the Trump administration is doing everything it can in its power, without enacting any legislation appeal, to restrict this. They're doing it with the immigration courts. They're doing it with the judges they're appointing, because in immigration court, where you can appeal your denial of asylum, the immigration judges can actually grant you asylum if you put on a decent case and you're credible. And it's an adversarial forum. But unfortunately, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III has just implemented a directive to put quotas on all the immigration judges, and the immigration courts are bursting at the seams. I don't know if anyone has seen the John Oliver YouTube, but that, oh, sorry, John Oliver did a wonderful YouTube, well, it's on YouTube. He just basically summarized in his wonderful, humorous, and cynical way what the immigration courts are really like. I call them imitation courts. And right now we have some good judges. I'm not excoriating the judges, but the judges are overloaded. And as one judge said, who used to be the chief judge and was one of the most eminent immigration lawyers in this country, she was the lawyer for the Cardoso Fonseca case, which is the United States Supreme Court case, which changed and expanded the laws for asylum. She said that doing asylum case in these courts is like doing death penalty in traffic courts. And it's true. It's really true. And most of these people don't even have lawyers. In England, they have like a public defender system for people that represent asylum and refugee status. So that's one thing. And then we have DACA, the DREAM Act, which we know what's happening with Trump, and he plays on that all the time. And there are over 800,000 young people in this country who came here as children, as infants, and who have worked so hard, go to school, go to college, go to graduate school, gainfully employed, have no criminal history. They cannot have a criminal history. And they can expel them like that. And then there's the troops at the border. And I just want to relate a little anecdote. In 1997, on the Texas-Mexico border, there was this teenager, a United States citizen, born and raised here, named Ezequiel Hernandez, a goat herd. Right on the border, he was herding his goats, and the U.S. Marines happened to be down there protecting our border. And they shot and killed him with impunity. And then they pulled the troops out. But no accountability, no whatsoever. He was not a terrorist. He was not a drug smuggler. He was a goat herd. And that's the kind of thing that we're facing right now if we put troops on. And I think that Texas has consented to that because the governors of the state have to consent to the troops, to the National Guard. So, given our history, and given what's going on now in this world with Europe and the Middle East, we are facing, I think, one of the ugliest and most frightening times with immigration law. And the Muslim ban, to me, is like the Muslim Exclusion Act. It really is, and let's call it what it is. And then excoriating and vilifying Mexicans and Latinos and Africans. This is a sanctioning of racism. It's taken it to a new low. We're going backwards. And what's interesting, the positive, if there is a positive thing, when we had the beginning of the Muslim bans, and I went to the airport with a lot of my colleagues, not all of them, to represent people as they were coming in. What was wonderful was all the different, the synagogues, the churches, all were supporting the Muslims. And that's going to happen more and more, like what we have here. And then there's the intersection with LGBT, because they're gay immigrants, and they have families that are part of the U.S. citizen family, and that they were excluded from here until 1990. And then, of course, we didn't have gay marriage, same-sex marriage. So that's all changed. It's all changed, and it's changing. But immigration, I do believe, is, I don't know what's going to happen with it, and the courts will have the final say. And of course, as you know, the president appoints all the federal judges. And those wonderful opinions in the Ninth Circuit, in the D.C. Circuit, can all be overturned in the United States Supreme Court. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Wow, on that light note, Hannah had me crying happy tears, great job. I wrote you a little note like we were in class. But she was paying attention because she's going to be a lawyer and didn't see my note. So that's why she's a lawyer and I'm not. My name is Mardi Moore. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm the executive director of Boulder County, which is your neighbor just down the street. I also want to thank the congregation for hosting us with a faith event on March 14th, I believe it was, here, and so grateful for the partnership, Elizabeth Borden and others who work with us regularly, and Christine and Pedro. So thank you, this congregation. Before I make my remarks, I do want to say, as I was sitting here watching you all assemble and thinking about discrimination, I started crying, not sobbing, but crying, because of so many good people in the room who would spend a Sunday afternoon thinking about these things. So thanks for all the work that you do individually, and thanks for being here today. I'm framing my comments around what I saw on the Facebook post, which is how far have we come since 1960, the civil rights movements of the 1960s. How can we make progress in this climate? What can we do as individuals? And how can we stand with others? So I understand, I missed Pedro's sermon this morning, but I understand it was around vulnerability. So I'm going to start with a little bit of vulnerability. So as an out lesbian, when I figured out I was a lesbian in the early 1980s at DU, from a pioneer family, good Methodists, as soon as I figured out I was a lesbian, I left the state. And it took me 30 years to get back, and I've been back about 4.5 years now. And part of my mission, my personal mission of working at Boulder County, is to make sure Colorado becomes a place where kids like me don't have to leave their family and the place they love to be honest with themselves. So that's part of the work that we do at Boulder with our youth programs. When I joined this movement back in the 1980s, it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic. So you want to talk about discrimination, you want to talk about people dying and not getting services, walking into a hospital room with friends dying and the nurses wouldn't touch them. The rooms hadn't been cleaned, insurers stacked to the ceiling, because that was all folks could get down and nobody was going to take them away. And I lived in Houston, Texas, and in Houston, Texas in 1986, I believe it was, there was a mayor named Louis Welch. And Louis Welch decided the way to cure AIDS was to kill all the gays. And he had made that very clear. And there were bumper stickers on it, because it's a driving community down there, on every gay cowboy truck and every car that said, "Don't shoot Louis." So that was the environment that I came of age in. So I knew we needed to do something, and I became active, and mostly at that time it was holding people's hands while they died, and being supportive of ACT UP and other organizations that were really working to change the tide. So that's the discrimination that I grew up with. Jump a little bit forward, and at some point all I wanted to do was to be able to have my partner have my Social Security should something happen to me. That's kind of all I wanted. Well, then Gene Dubofsky came along, and the world opened up, and there were some other choices to be made. But I have to share one experience. So after Gavin Newsom opened up marriage in San Francisco in the 90s, Multnomah County, which is where Portland, Oregon is, opened up marriage. So my partner and I went down at the time, and there were 600 people from the state of Washington who got married in about 3 weeks, I think it was. I didn't realize how discriminated I had been until I actually walked through that courthouse, and the woman in the beehive hairdo gave us a marriage license. I've never felt anything like that. I had no idea the barriers that had been put in place. Now, 60 days later, they sent us our money back and said this is null and void. And that didn't sit well with my children. So, that's a little bit of my personal stuff where I come out. I do want to say that, talking about the vulnerable piece, so LGBT folks in Boulder County and people who run social service organizations are tired. We were all, for the most part, underfunded organizations prior to the election of Donald Trump. And Hannah and I were talking ahead of time, and she mentioned to me that the day after Trump won, they had support groups at Fairview because people were so decimated by the results. I walked into the office the day after the election, and our office was full of mostly trans folks crying, scared for their lives. And that hasn't let up, because this administration, depending upon the day, and it's about every day, and we don't even hear about the judge appointments, the judicial appointments, every day. So when the trans ban went into effect, The number of people contemplating and talking about suicide in support groups went through the roof. Young people and old people. There are detrimental effects from every nasty tweet this guy sends out. And it takes a toll on leadership also. And I'll be vulnerable and say I've spent 6 months of serious depression because of the weight. Now that lifted, thank God. And I had no idea. And it lifted because of the work. And one of the things that's been said here already is, so if we look around the room, we're mostly white, right? You look around Out Boulder programming, it's mostly white. Well, a couple days after the election, it became clear to me as a leader, the same people who hate you for being a Mexican hate me for being a lesbian. This is not breaking news, but people continue to talk about intersectional work and not do it. Out Boulder would show a movie once a year. That was our intersectional work. That is not the change that we make. So Out Boulder became the organizing force between the attempt to make Longmont a sanctuary city. Because you know what? We serve undocumented queer folk. And they left not just because of economic reasons. They left for safety concerns. And so our work with Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, one of our closest partners right now, is important work. We show up at all their events. I have sat with people as they at court to make sure ICE isn't picking them up on the way out the door. So we're doing work like that. But one of the things, we talk about inclusive, right? So there's equity work, there's diversity work, and now the buzzword is inclusive. And for months I've been noodling on this, and finally somebody said yesterday, we were like pulling weeds, and she's like, well, here's the word for that. I'm like, really? And the word is expansive. So we recently received a large grant for us, and we're doing a queer and trans people of color leadership summit. And what that's going to mean to the community, to commissions, to people wanting to run for office, to what our organization looks like, to what young kids who are LGBT, who are kids of color, to see people in leadership that look like them. I know it made all the difference to me as a woman. So I'm very excited about that piece. And so I don't think you'll hear Out Boulder talking about inclusive work, because that means I'm the white person sitting at the table and I want to include you in my work. There's a reason people don't want to be included. So we're talking about doing expansive work and creating a variety of tables with leadership that comes together in that to move everybody forward and not just one section of the community. I really appreciated, and I'll put the microphone down, but I really appreciated what Hannah said about the hatefulness, the hateful rhetoric. So I alluded to that, but one of the things that is really hard is social media, right? And so we have, as Out Boulder, and personally I have done the same, have pulled back in what I'm putting out there because it's such a toxic environment and it's not real conversations that are happening. It's a great screen for attack. And so, you know, in the community that I serve, trans women are being killed on a regular basis. You won't see us posting about that. You will see us posting about solutions. And that's the work that we're doing. Michael Doherty, who's here with the district attorney, stand before Michael. We work closely with the police. There's hate crimes and hate incidents happening that aren't being reported because of not trusting the police enough yet. That's work we're trying to do and build out, so we really know what's going on in the community. So with all that, there is good news. We are surviving. There's one thing that I hope Jean will speak to. There's a major Supreme Court ruling that's going to come down in June called the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And I hope Jean will speak to that. I called her the other day and got some insight. So right now we're hoping for the best and planning for the worst. It'll be targeted against gay and lesbian community. So I'm never going to be out of work.
Talk from up here so I can see you, and I guess it's on. Is it on?
You just need to point it towards you.
Well, maybe he's
Right there.
There, it's on.
Use this one, Jane.
Turn that off.
Oh.
Now it is.
All right.
Can you hear me better? Oh, yes, all right. I was supposed to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been involved in my life. I think I'm one of the luckiest people in the world who've been able to find some things that I felt strongly about and get paid for doing some of it. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and the U.S. Supreme Court desegregated my grade school, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, when I was in 6th grade. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about that case because I think the strategy in that case was really interesting. Topeka, sort of, if you thought of Topeka when it was first developed, it was like a little circle, and there were 5 little black communities around it, typical of many communities in the South. Well, Topeka grew beyond that. So the segregated grade schools for the black children were often farther away for them than the white grade schools. And Linda Brown, who was the daughter of one of the plaintiffs who died last week, walked right past a white grade school to get to her school. So, what did that mean? That meant that the U.S. Supreme Court got a case where you didn't have to worry about busing or things that developed after that because it was easy to integrate the grade schools. The junior high and high school were already integrated. There wasn't a problem there. So I think one of the things we need to watch for in the course of going forward and hopefully undoing some of the things that have been happening is to be very strategic about it. Not ask for more than you're likely to get, and just not giving up, but not going crazy about things. Anyway, I will skip along. I went to Harvard Law School when 2% of the people in my class were women. Now, when you think about going to law school, Hannah, more than 50% of the students most likely will be women. But my first class in law school, the professor announced, this was the famous professor who was sort of the symbol of how bad Harvard Law School could be, that the women would not be called on, nor were we to volunteer. The class would hear from us on Ladies' Day, which was a joke, because it was the least important topic of the year. And the questions were handed down from the young women who participated in those classes year by year. And that was it. That was the message we got when we started law school. It took a few years before the law school could stop that practice, but it had been going on for the 11, 12 years before I got there, from the time women were first admitted. One of the things that I worked on after I finished law school and went to work for Senator Mondale was the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Its anniversary is this week, 50 years since that act was adopted by Congress. The chief sponsor of the act, Senator Mondale, was allowed to be the chief sponsor because nobody thought it was going to pass. Well, he worked pretty hard on it, got it out of his banking subcommittee on housing, got it to the floor of the Senate, and there was a real filibuster, one that went on for days and days and days. And those of us who were staff people who were working on that got to work on what was really an incredible experience of lawmaking, meeting every morning with the leading senators who were planning the filibuster for the day, and really getting a lot of information out about private discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. That bill became law only because of the assassination of Martin Luther King. The bill had gone from the Senate to the House, where it had really already died. And then, when he was assassinated, The House moved it, and within 10 days after his death, the bill became law. Well, there's some problems with fair housing. All you have to do is look around you, and you can see that we still have incredible segregation in housing. Maybe the most dramatic problem we have. A little bit of my water. And one of the reasons for that is that the fair housing law did not address discrimination by government. So housing loans guaranteed by the government were not available for blacks. And many local governments, through their zoning ordinances, did not allow people to move out of black neighborhoods. There's a book, one of the most remarkable books I've read in a long time, that came out last year, called The Color of Law. And it's about housing patterns that were created and maintained by government at all levels until quite recently. And just in the last several weeks, been articles on the front page of the New York Times about how the Housing and Urban Development Department is retreating on enforcing fair housing laws, and about Facebook ads that target particular people to receive notice of houses for sale or for rent, and a de facto continuation of discrimination. And now I'm going to switch to another topic. I'm going to switch to the Amendment 2 case. Some of you, I think most of you probably remember Amendment 2, but often there are people who didn't live in Colorado at the time or who are too young to remember what it did. But it was adopted by the voters in 1992. It prohibited all branches of state government, that included the courts, and all levels of government, including local government, county government, from remedying any claim of discrimination against a person or on the basis of what was called homosexual orientation or conduct. The advantage to that amendment was that it swept so broadly that it gave us a way of getting the U.S. Supreme Court to start on the road to protecting LGBT rights. The case was tried for 4 weeks, broadcast live on Fort TV, which was still around, so it was seen by people across the country. And eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the plaintiff's favor. One of the battles we'd had along the way was whether we should ask for more than just overturning Amendment 2. Our colleagues, I was up to trade. Very sweet and continuing. Our colleagues in the national gay rights organizations were very interested in, at that point, going after restrictions on gays in the military, getting the case of Bowers versus Hardwick overturned, and gay marriage. And my view was that we can't do all of that. We can only go after one thing at a time, and we have to do it in a way that may result down the road in some different policies. I had no idea that things would move as fast as they did. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Bowers versus Hardwick, which had been decided only 9 years before the Amendment 2 case got to the Supreme Court. That case kept the criminalization of gay sex conduct. And 9 years, that was what we had to deal with, all the awful language in that case. But 1990, can't remember, it was 3 years after the Amendment 2 case was decided in 1996, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Bowers. And then the next step that came within just a few years were the gay marriage cases. And I didn't think I'd see that in my lifetime. So in this area, we made what I think are immense strides in a very short period of time. And one of the reasons I think those strides came so quickly was something that Marty was talking about, was the AIDS crisis. And that started bringing people out. Because as soon as people started identifying as LGBT, of course that word wasn't used then, but as soon as they started identifying, then all of a sudden people would say, oh yeah, I know that person. And it just made an immense difference. By the time we tried the Amendment 2 case, almost all of our expert witnesses, who were very well-known people, were lesbian or gay men. And all of a sudden, some of the plaintiffs, Boulder's superintendent of schools, identified as a gay man. Some of you may remember that. All of that just started making a difference, not just in the court system, but around in communities. So now the support for LGBT rights among younger people is just an incredibly high percentage. And I think that has been one of the wonderful things that has come over the past few years. Now, the Trump administration is trying to back away from some of that. I don't think they're going to get very far. And I actually don't think they're going to end up pushing very far. We'll see. I mean, it's the same people, as Marty said, who don't like LGBT, who don't like blacks, who don't like Latinos, who often don't like women. And I think one of the things that has been happening is that we can now see how much opposition to women as leaders, how much opposition on the basis of race, sexual orientation, and how the advances in those areas could really be lost. And I think people maybe needed a wake-up call. But at any rate, there are some real problems. And although I said I thought that most of the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation was easing, there is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And one of the things that's interesting about that case is that a lot of people will say, well, why in the world is where one can buy a wedding cake a real problem? It's like all First Amendment cases that involve speech particularly. They're on little issues, at least you think they are little issues, but they really aren't, because the case itself will provide a lot of precedent. What would this case do? It could put limitations on all of the public accommodations laws, which entitle people to be able to go into and be served at any store, any kind of restaurant, hotel, anything like that. Colorado's had public accommodations laws since the end of the 1800s, but sexual orientation was not added until I think it was 1997. It's been fairly recent. At any rate, the case basically says that because the First Amendment protects religion and free speech, it prevails over a civil rights law that protects LGBT people. And therefore, people who have strongly held religious beliefs ought to be able to exercise those beliefs. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, has never allowed people who didn't want to serve someone on the basis of race to refuse to do so because of their religious views. So that issue got pushed down in the case, and I don't think the U.S. Supreme Court will probably get to it. The only people really arguing that, not even the Baker and his counsel and amici, is the Trump administration. The Trump administration, in this case, for the first time in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division history, is on the side arguing against civil rights laws. But the case will probably go off on sort of an intermediate ground that a lot of libertarians have been arguing, particularly libertarians that Justice Kennedy likes. Justice Kennedy wrote all of the gay rights cases, but he's also quite a libertarian on free speech issues. So, the people who are working on this case are pitching their arguments to him. He could come down somewhere in the middle, which would say on the free speech part of the case. People are saying you can't compel me to speak. And so that would depend upon whether asking a baker to make a wedding cake for a gay couple is compelled speech. There have been some cases, one out of New Mexico, which the court did not take, involving whether a wedding photographer was having to provide compelled speech in photographing a gay wedding. And there's some other cases you can think of. Where would you draw the line on this? Well, I frankly think the facts in the case from Colorado are not good, because the two men who went into the bakery to get their wedding cake did not get in as far as talking about what they wanted to put on the wedding cake in terms of decoration or script. The baker just said, sorry, I don't make wedding cakes for gay couples. End up being in the store. And that baker sells wedding cakes to everyone. It's not a compelled message if you sell your cakes to everyone. So the court could come down on this case in a way that doesn't change much, and that's what I'm hoping will happen. I just can't see a wholesale turning back on the gay rights cases right now. And
That's it.
Thank you, Jean. How are we doing on this one? It's okay? I thought it would be timely after Jean spoke to put in a plug for the fact that we have copies available for purchase of Sue Casey's biography of Jean Dubofsky. There's a particularly fetching picture of Jean from 1979 on the back. I think they come pre-autographed, but maybe Jean would be willing to give each of your purchases a special kiss. In lieu of an autograph. We're a little bit beyond the timeline that we hoped for, so I think rather than the period of time in which we were going to have some interplay amongst the members of the panel, we'll go right to Q&A from you all, and I, knowing of how reticent this congregation is, will expect a hand or two to come up. So, who would like to pose a question, and if you would direct it to one or the other members of the panel, we'll go from there. So, yes. You need the mic?
Yes. Question for Sandra.
You need the mic.
Question for Sandra. What does the quota system mean for judges?
It's what it means is that it's sort of like the way I think it was George W. Bush wanted to do for teachers. You have to get so many exam passes for the students before you get your raise and your salary, something like that. That's the analogy. What Sessions wants is the judges to complete 700 removal or deportation cases per year. Otherwise, they get a downgrade in their rating. In other words, it's punitive, and it's totally a violation of due process.
Right.
I mean, there's no way that any judge can possibly adjudicate or decide a case, on the fast track like that. It just goes against everything that due process guarantees. Due process.
Using due process would be adding judges.
Thank you.
Duh.
And there has been an allocation of funds by Congress to add judges, but so far it isn't happening at breakneck speed. And Sessions is and will be handpicking those judges.
Karen.
My basic question is, and it sounds kind of stupid, what can we do? We call our Congress, our representatives, we demonstrate, we march, we give money, we're volunteers, we support individuals that we know. And it all feels so impotent, while the whole thing just feels like it's going down the toilet. And you folks and others, thank God for you, and you have the talents and the dedication, you're equipped to be in there on the front lines, but I don't know what to do. At this point, I mean, it feels like the only thing available to us is the ballot box. And in Colorado, we really, there's a limited amount that's going to happen in 2018. So that's my question. And I don't mean to be demoralizing, but this is really what I wrestle with.
I don't have an answer. I really don't have an answer. All those things that you're doing, we have to. So something that's helped me, I was back at a conference, the National LGBTQ Task Force Creating Change Conference, and Ray Carey, who's a lesbian leader in the national movement, she was giving her State of the Movement speech, and this is actually one of the first steps of me getting out of my depression. And she's up there in front of 4,000 people, and she said, "Some days I don't have hope." And she said, on those days when I don't have hope, I know that you have hope, and you have hope, and you have hope. And the collective hope is what's going to get us through these times. So that was key to me, knowing those days when I just don't feel like I've got it, somebody else has got it. And the other thing was to be for her to be vulnerable enough to say, some days I don't have hope. Because I've been walking around acting like, well, if I don't have hope, then what's going to happen? Which didn't help my psychological state much. But we just got to keep doing it. Another thing that I'll add is, I was bemoaning I was out in my yard, a black friend of mine from college called me and she said, "What are you doing today, Marty?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just so tired." I said, "The world is going just down the toilet and I don't know what to do and I'm tired." And she said, "You think you're tired? You ought to go talk to some old black people."
Just to add to that, I think also it's important to remember that young people are watching, and that even if it seems that Congress or politicians aren't taking into consideration your actions, your kids or your grandkids are, and you're setting a precedent for future generations to be able to stand up, and hopefully when they are of voting age or when they have the opportunity to really make a difference, your impact on their lives will have been to show them that they do have a voice and that they should speak out when they see something that is wrong.
And when do you turn 18?
Next January.
Too late. Kevin.
This is maybe not so much a question, but a response to Karen. One of the things you'll notice about all these people up here that are doing such a great job is a lot of them have a personal investment in the cause for which they struggle. And because of this intersectionality, that's a great idea because you all, if you're not disabled now, will soon, before you die, you're so likely to have a disabling condition for a significant amount of time. Some of us have just beat you all to the finish line there, but it's going to happen to you, and so you'll become a part of a group that's discriminated against regularly. And in fact, it's written into the ADA that the accommodations required by the ADA don't apply to churches. That's right. Unless they have more than 40 employees, because I thought it was because the state didn't want to tell the church what they had to do. No, it's because churches lobbied not to be included in the ADA. And that's why there's a lot of need for change.
Thank you, Kevin.
So thanks so much. This is an amazing panel. My question is mostly for Eugene. The success story that you tell about gay marriage really is. I mean, that's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. I think, from what I gather from what all the panelists have said. And you made a really striking point, with which I agree. It was only because basically there were so many gays and lesbians, they were everywhere, right? All of a sudden you turn around, your sister-in-law was a lesbian. I think that's right. How do we get that, how do we make a parallel, or how do we apply that to issues where there are such deeply entrenched racial discriminations, and we will never achieve that kind of critical mass, that kind of ubiquity of the discriminated against class. What principle can we draw from the gay marriage success story to use in achieving the end of racial discrimination?
Well, comments that people have made about various groups working together, so each little group isn't completely isolated, I think are very important. But there's another thing that I think is really important, and that is support for public education. We are moving away from support for public education. We don't appropriate enough money for it. The schools then go downhill, and then the people who can afford it pull out of the schools, and the public schools are left to people who don't have any other access to education. And they don't get a very good education. So my general sense is that every time an issue comes up that involves public education, we'll really need to be involved in that because it cuts across everywhere.
Does that mean we should all go to Oklahoma right now? And try and protest?
In Kentucky.
Well, I'm going to do a tack on to Jean's comment, which is, and in public education, the need to restore attention to civics and government and history.
Yes. So I'm going to change the conversation a little bit because I have a question about workplace gender and sexual harassment, and really just harassment in general. And in dealing with some of these things in my life, what I've come to realize is that the people in the workplace, and it has to do a lot with age, have different sets of norms for what acceptable behavior is. And my experience with sort of the generic training that we get in the workplace to identify these things and change them does not appear to be adequate. So I'd be interested in really comments from anybody about how to sort of change the norm. Jean, you mentioned the fact of your experience at Harvard and how women were treated. And that's not a unique experience to the law profession. It happens in science and it happens in other places where those people were treated and they just said, well, that's the way it is. I want to work in this field and that's the way it is. And I think they've carried that even to today, that sort of mindset that, I'm in this field and it's just the way it is. How do we change that? How do we get to a place where we're less tolerant of that kind of corrosive behavior?
Me too.
Well, a lot of that, I think, has to do with stereotyping, particularly for women. I think women are trained from a pretty early age, at least my age group, not to speak up very often. And pretty soon, people think they don't have anything to contribute. And that's not really the case. It's because they're often been socialized to the point of not being too obvious, even though they have important jobs. I just think that's a matter of time. I think things are going to change relatively quickly. When I first started working with young women law clerks on the Supreme Court particularly, there were men and more women every year. But a lot of the women would end every comment with raising their voice like it was a question. or would not be willing to decide and write something down unless they checked with the judge all the time. And this is funny, but one of the things I think has made a major difference for younger women is participation in sports. You learn not to be afraid of losing. And I think women my age, because they didn't have those opportunities, often were really afraid of losing. And that's going away, just like so many other ways in which women, I'm talking just about women, have been discriminated against.
So one more question, I think. Go ahead. Yep.
Sorry. Dean, I have a question for you. I'm an immigrant from Norway, and in our educational system, the federal government gets the money and they disperse it to the schools. There was a recent article, I think, in the New York Times comparing the US with Canada. And in Canada, the federal government takes in the money and then they distribute it equally among the schools. We have a totally different system here with local taxation. What do you think is the chance that that may change?
David should probably be answering this question because he's had a lot more experience with dealing with that, so I'm going to give it to you.
No fair. Well, this implicates so many things when I think of it in terms of the political situation and the legal situation in Colorado. One of them, and one that is under attack now with a bunch of people, including myself, is the hurdle that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights poses to equity and adequacy in public education. The other, I think it appears right after Genesis in the Bible, is local control of schools, which is an article of faith in Colorado and presents its own challenges, and that's not going away. So the ability at the state level to prescribe the kinds of changes that I think you're probably alluding to bump up against that problem. And the adequacy of our tax system, and Tabor is a piece of the solution there, to have adequate resources, to have the kind of school system that this state deserves, is going to be a long haul to get to the right answer. We live in a kind of delusional reality because of the other assets that Colorado has, attracts very highly educated people, and we sort of have the sense that we're getting along pretty well. But you look at what we're doing with our schools, the universities, colleges, we're living on borrowed time, and that can't go on forever. And so, school district elections, state legislative elections, I'm not sure there's much that you can do that we aren't trying to do in the courts on Tabor. I'm going to abuse the privilege of the chair and suggest that in all of this, as serious as it is, we will be aided by maintaining a sense of humor. And so I will tell you what I think is one of the funniest things to come out of my experience, not directly in this general area, which happened back in the late 90s when the Congress was dealing with this ill-conceived and ultimately ill-fated piece of legislation called the Defense of Marriage Act. And back in that day, there was still the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and so one evening they had brought in Bob Barr, a Republican conservative congressman from Georgia, to debate Elizabeth, what was her last name, the head of the Human Rights Campaign, yeah. And it was a beautiful setup in which Jim Lehrer sort of established the context for this conversation about why are you for the Defense of Marriage Act, why are you against it. And Elizabeth started off by turning to Bob Barr and saying, well, Congressman, which marriage are you here to defend? Your first, your second, or your third? So, with thanks to our wonderful panel and